Well, of course, you cover both sides of the Atlantic, so that's pretty much this world, and it reaches into the next. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Let me see how I can do this. Ooh. Wow. Okay. Familiar slide there. They won't all be quite perhaps that familiar. So, Christians believe that Jesus Christ, by his passion and death and resurrection, broke the power of Satan and death. But we still have to die. And the resurrection of the dead, of which Christ's resurrection is the pledge, is not yet a consummated fact. So we wonder, what happens to Christians after death? What happens to people after death? We Christians wonder. That's another way to put that, probably a better way to put that. How are we to understand the pilgrimage of body and soul from this world to the next in the light of Christ's victory over death? One starting point for this reflection is the tradition concerning the descent into hell. The first letter of Peter tells us, "For Christ also died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and preached to the spirits in prison." Ephesians 4, 8-10, and a gloss on Psalm 68 tells us that Christ descended into the lower parts of the earth before ascending on high and leading a host of captives in his train. The Apostles' Creed, which is here on the slide, states that Jesus Christ descended into hell. So it's an article of faith, but the question is, what does that mean? There have, of course, been a host of different interpretations of the descent into hell. Calvin thought that Christ's descent into hell essentially took place on the cross when he suffered and died for our sake. Karl Barth agreed with him about that. After all, it could not have been necessary for Christ to visit hell. The Passion was already a complete and perfect deliverance from sin and death. Nonetheless, many Christians have thought of the descent into hell in terms of what the Swiss Catholic theologian Hans-Urs von Balthasar calls the mystery of Holy Saturday. And Christian liturgies for Holy Saturday reflect this idea. The emphasis in this case is on the saving power of Christ's passion being imparted to the dead who are awaiting his coming. Early Christians, taking their cue from 1 Peter 3:19, thought it fitting that Christ would have spent his time on Holy Saturday, that is, while he was being dead, preaching a saving message to the righteous dead of Israel. In fact, according to Hippolytus, including Adam, all the way back to Adam, the patriarchs and prophets, all the way back to Adam. Some of them pictured this descent into hell as something like a military invasion, Christ confronting the ruling powers of Hades and breaking down the gates of this dark fortress after the manner of Psalm 24:7. "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." And some authorities interpreting the passage in Matthew where the tombs open and the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, see this descent into hell as involving the actual raising of the righteous dead right on the spot. In many churches today, even, this late 4th century Greek homily, which I've projected here, does this look familiar at all? Have you ever seen this before? I might like to give you a few minutes just to take a look at this extraordinary rhetoric and dramatic language, very vivid depiction. So this is a 4th century Greek homily. It's in the Patrologia Graeca. Some attribute it to Epiphanius, who was a bishop in Cyprus. This is read out loud on Holy Saturday in, at least in some Orthodox and Catholic churches, and I think Lutheran I'm not sure. Anyway, it's amazing. Something strange is happening. There is a great silence on earth today, a great silence and stillness. The whole earth keeps silence because the king is asleep. So God has died in the flesh, and hell, the realm of the dead, trembles with fear. So understand hell here now as Hades, as Sheol, as the realm of the dead. Though Christians reflecting on this will also sometimes, in their minds, drift over to thinking about a realm of punishment, eternal punishment. But for now, just think about it as the realm of the dead. So Christ has died and has gone to search for our first parent as for a lost sheep. So this is the amazing part of this, and I'm going to show you some icons that depict this. Christ approaches Adam, and they greet each other, and he takes him by the hand and raises him up, saying, and this is familiar from St. Paul, and it may have been a hymn, "Awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light." He sort of grabs him, says that. And then he says to him, "I am your God who for your sake became your son. Out of love for you and your descendants, I now by my own authority command all who are held in bondage to come forth." So it's really quite a dramatic statement. This is amazing where he says, "Rise up, work of my hands, you who were created in my image. I did not create you to be a prisoner of hell." So, we're busting out of here is essentially what he's saying. So whether you associate the descent into hell with Good Friday or Holy Saturday, or both, the basic message is the same. It's that Christ has conquered death by dying, and that we, fallen creatures, have in a sense been rewired, remade. One of my favorite Christian writers is St. Anselm of Canterbury, and in this text, which most people read because it has this amazing argument for the existence of God based on the definition of God as something than which no greater can be thought, but the very lyrical beginning to that, he addresses God, because the whole text is a prayer addressed to God, and says, "You who made me and remade me, me ficisti et me refecisti." You made me and you remade me. This is the idea here, that we've been remade and rewired. The death still happens, but it doesn't have the last word. It doesn't have the same effect. And we are being called to awaken even now from spiritual deadness. So I want to take a look at some traditional images, icons of this. It is actually the most common way to picture the resurrection in Eastern iconography. And perhaps that's something that you've seen before and know about. So I don't want to not going to sort of do a whole art history lecture here, but just in an impressionistic sort of way, I want to show some images. And then looking with these images in mind, I want to address some problems that we face as Christians thinking about the afterlife. I'm even going to suggest that these images provide a key to their solution. So, as I said, this is a traditional way of depicting the resurrection. You see the breaking of the fortress or tomb. You see Christ meeting Adam, and you see other of the righteous dead of Israel and the patriarchs and prophets. Here's an Anatolian example of the same idea. Another one. The reason I'm going to go through a bunch of these is I want to notice something that's been really impressive to me about similarities across different cultural manifestations of this iconographic theme. I'm not going to tell you all about the context for these. This is not an art history lecture, just images. That's the from the Barberini. Actually, I will tell you this. It's from an Exultet roll. These are the rolls that were used to read the Easter proclamation at the Easter Vigil. That's a baptismal font from the 12th century, from the Midlands in England. It's a little fuzzy there, but it's got the same idea. dragging Adam out of hell. Get a manuscript. Impressive one. That's Duco di Buoninsegna, Descent into Hell. Master of the Osservanza. So we're moving into Western art here, Western Renaissance art. Angelico. Mantegna. Albrecht Dürer. I'm going to stop on this one. I actually have a reproduction of this icon hanging in my bedroom, and I look at it when I'm anxious about something. It's partly because this was done by a Russian Orthodox iconographer who was an émigré living in Paris in the 1920s, this circle of Russian Orthodox émigrés of artists and intellectuals. And this was done on the walls of a church, so it's fresco-style icon. It's a little bit unusual in the sense that you focus entirely on Christ and Adam, and that's Eve, of course, next to Adam. So it really, narrows the focus so that you see that relationship between Christ and Adam. But in other respects, there have been two things that have been absolutely unvarying in all these different manifestations of this theme. One is that Christ and Adam resemble each other. Their faces look the same, and it's very interesting because you have the old Adam looking aged, and the new Adam, the second Adam, ever youthful. Eve, I think, is generally, naturally at Adam's side, having come from his side, in certain sense almost incorporated into Adam, because Adam is all humanity, and Eve is the feminine manifestation of that. So they're close together. But the other thing that I've noticed, and I have never seen an exception to this, is that Christ always takes Adam by the wrist, never by the hand. Does that suggest anything to you? May I ask you that question? Anyone thinking about that? It's always by the wrist. I'm wondering what impression that creates in you. Yeah.
Well, two things. One is,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. I mean, if you took him by the hand, potentially Adam could let go, and then we'd have a really bad situation, right? So this is, this is sola gratia. This is Christ's initiative here. And so it's very much like the narrative we just saw, where he says, I did not create you to be a prisoner of hell. I'm commanding you to leave here. I'm taking you out. We're busting out of here. So that wonderful, the gaze of of Christ and Adam looking at each other, and then that grabbing by the wrist. Athanasius says that he points out that we were created out of nothing, and we're always tending to kind of fall back into nothing, and will do so unless God breaks our fall and pulls us back. So I mentioned the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. He's famous for profound, though perhaps doctrinally just a little bit dicey, meditation on this event. I don't plan to go into what might or might not be dicey about it, but anyway, according to Balthasar, Christ descended to the very depths of the bottomless abyss, thus are his words, taking on himself the penalty of the damned, experiencing utter dereliction and estrangement from the Father in this mystery of Holy Saturday. So there has been quite a battle about this question. A young woman named Alyssa Pitstick, even when it was just a doctoral dissertation, this was causing a great deal of commotion, said that essentially Balthasar is a heretic. But anyway, I'm not going to enter into this debate. but I simply want to take the iconography of the descent into hell as an emblem for thinking about not the atonement, because that would be a whole other subject that's way beyond my capacity, but to think about the human part and how Christians have reflected on the human receptive part in this drama. And in particular, in terms of this idea of an interim period between the individual death and the resurrection of the dead. So, and I think this image really helps me deal with some problems that have arisen in terms of reflecting on that, on individuals and their experience between death and the final resurrection. I have 4 problems in mind. These are they. Problem with immortality. Christians shouldn't dwell on it. The problem with heaven, imagination can't grasp it. The problem with hell, love can't bear it. The problem with purgatory, Christians can't or don't. Maybe they can, but at the moment they don't entirely agree on it. So, as I've suggested, I don't think these problems are insurmountable. And when I look at that icon on my bedroom wall, I feel like I'm seeing the key to their solution, or within the limits of what we can know in this life and with our frail brains. So, the problem with immortality, Christians shouldn't dwell on it. The story of C.S. Lewis's conversion to Christianity, I think of in terms of this. It's a well-known story, at least as he describes it in his memoir, Surprised by Joy. And he talks about how he pursued joy throughout his life, beginning with his brother bringing a toy biscuit tin in, and through his love of Wagner and Norse mythology and all of that. And he tells us that each one of these signposts, each one of these things that seem to trigger or elicit a sense of longing was really a message to him, telling him that he was made for the beatific vision. In Mere Christianity, he makes an argument from desire for the beatific vision, that we were made for something more. He says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. So if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So this is an argument for heaven from the fact that we have this sort of infinite desires that we can never satisfy. And in addition to this argument from desire, of course, as you know, I think Lewis had many deep things to say about heaven and about eternal life, about hell, about purgatory. So, therefore, it may be a bit surprising to realize, or to remind ourselves that Lewis had misgivings about dwelling on the afterlife. This is the first of my problems, the first problem about heaven. In fact, he said he was really glad that at the time of his conversion, he wasn't thinking about the promise of eternal life, that was not a motivation. That was very important to him. It came as a gift later, as a kind of, bonus, It was enough that God was real. He said it was enough that heaven should exist, whether I get to go there or not. The idea that he should get to go there, of course, was proposed to him, but it wasn't a motivation. One of the reasons that I think Lewis felt that it was a good thing that he hadn't been focusing on immortality was that in his day, a concern for the afterlife, along with other sort of occult and paranormal interests, was a kind of ersatz religion. And he had some good friends in the 1920s, Leo Baker, Rodney Pasley, who fell for the charms of spiritualism. And then his great hero poet, Yeats, when he met him finally in Oxford, he decided was kind of a tawdry figure because he had gotten sort of caught up in spiritualism. There was a priest, an Anglo-Irish priest, he refers to as Cranny, who had entered holy orders without believing in Christ, and he said ended up an old, dirty, gabbling, tragic Irish parson obsessed with finding evidence for survival. I had a relative like that, actually, who claimed to be an absolute determinist and a materialist and all of that, but she was obsessed with, with parapsychology and evidence for, and she knew I was kind of interested in some of these things and studying them, so she would always ask me when I would see him, what have you found? Have you got some new evidence for me of human survival, of bodily death? But most disturbing of all for Lewis was the descent into madness of his companion, Mrs. Moore's brother. And he doesn't really know what the cause of this was, but he did notice that this brother had been that type of being just obsessed with evidence for survival and getting into the sort of esoterica of theosophy and yoga and psychoanalysis and other occult things like that. And he went stark raving mad, and Lewis had to hold him down. He was eventually institutionalized and died. So, Lewis says, the whole question of immortality became rather disgusting to me. And he said, concern for immortality led to this raving on the floor. In fact, all romantic longings, he said, led to this. So he was very glad then that it wasn't, that his conversion did not have to do with the hankering after survival. And it may be also that, in a sense, he was sympathetic to critiques one hears from a Freudian or a Marxist standpoint, that the desire for heaven or for immortality is narcissistic, that it's a compensatory, wish-fulfilling fantasy. So in a sense, he was saying, well, yes, that's true. It could be that. It could be that. But there is this slogan, abusus non tollit abusum, that the abuse of something does not destroy its proper use. And I think Lewis came to think that this narcissism could be cured if it was a component in one's desire for heaven with God's help, perhaps by suffering, perhaps by going through the trial of doubt, perhaps by the burden and ecstasy of loving someone other than oneself. So Julian of Norwich says we should pray to God to purify the ground of our prayer, of our beseeching. It's that idea that you can want it, and you can want it partly for the wrong reasons, but if what you want is truly heaven, and if you are open to having the ground of your beseeching purified, then perhaps the motivations will be set right later on. Lewis's friend Tolkien, I hope you don't mind my bringing in the Inklings here, but I have been thinking about them. He said that death and immortality was actually the major theme of The Lord of the Rings. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you know that the elves were immortal, right? Not in the sense of eternity, but that they would live as long as the cycles of the world lasted. And if they got killed in battle or something, or an accident or something, they would get reincarnated, or in some other way they would live on. So they had that promise. In other words, what they had was a version of what sometimes people call immortality, which is extreme longevity. Of course, that's what vampires have too, right? Extreme longevity. That's what, in many cases, this sort of ersatz religion of the afterlife is after, that extreme longevity. So what Tolkien wants us to see, that for the elves, this produces a kind of melancholy. They try to preserve the artifacts and memories of the past. They get sad and weary after a long time. Paul Tillich said that immortality understood in terms of a temporal longevity like that would be his definition of hell. And I think that's what Tolkien is saying here. And for men who are mortal, doomed to die, as the rhyme goes, some of them were tempted the elves envied the men for their gift of mortality. Some of the men envy the elves for that extreme longevity. And Tolkien said in one of his letters that the wickedness in men takes the form of trying to get that, what would be a counterfeit immortality for yourself. It's what produces among the small a golem, and among the great a ringwraith, because that would be Sauron's gift, the promise of that extreme longevity, but it's a poisonous gift. So what Lewis and Tolkien are telling us is that there's a difference between what Christians really mean by immortality, which entails transformation in Christ, and which costs death, and a counterfeit immortality in which we cling to our old life and our narrow, possessive, precious, individualistic self. So when we're clear about that difference, we can set aside some of the concerns that people have about longing for immortality. You may have also heard that it's improper for Christians to use soul language, to speak about the immortality of the soul. And there was a biblical theologian named Oscar Coleman who in a passionate lecture on this at Harvard, kind of threw down the gauntlet and said, you have to choose immortality or resurrection. And he contrasted the death of Jesus in agony to the death of Socrates, calm, knowing that his soul was immortal and not really feeling that it was anything but a just serene transition, to make his point. So again, this is another debate I can't go into in detail, but I just want to distill what I think has become and has always been the more sturdy and pastorally wise consensus Christian view, which is that although it is wrong for Christians to speak about death as if it were nothing but a serene transition, in which a naturally immortal soul is repatriated to its own country. It's equally wrong to think of death as annihilation. Human beings created in the image and likeness of God, created to share in his glory, wounded by sin, retain this spiritual dimension, experienced in life as conscience and as love, upheld by the love and power of God who created us and recreated us, and providing a principle of continuity between the living human person and the person, for instance, a lost loved one who passes beyond our mortal sight. But the thing is that Christians do not think of the soul as a kind of fifth essence stored in the body and released at death. Although there is a sense in which some of the death awareness movement, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and that kind of spiritualizing of the experience of the dying, for all the good that it also did tend to somewhat make people think along these ways. But Christians do not think of the discarnate soul as the complete self. Therefore, it couldn't be just the sort of serene homecoming that some of the death awareness literature would have us think. They don't think of the soul's immortality as intrinsic, as one's own possession, but rather as a gift, the gift of life, as part of the gift of life itself. So that means the Christian soul is quite different from the Platonic or the Hindu or the Gnostic or the Cartesian or the New Age soul. It's more creaturely, it's more implicated in the life of the body, it's more dependent on God, it's more vulnerable. And its journey will not be complete until we are raised body and soul as the living unity that God designed us to be. So we're not satisfied with simple forms of immortalism, certainly not with immortality pills or brains in vats, or which is actually the subject of Lewis's That Hideous Strength. That was actually a lot of science fiction satire was written around that time about brains in vats. Yeah. So I think as Christians we affirm that our identity is not a metaphysical fact, but a spiritual mystery hidden with Christ in God. Okay, that's the first one. I'm skipping a little bit because we have a clock. Just want to see what I'm doing with time. Okay, good. All right, next problem with heaven. Imagination can't grasp it. I don't have a picture for that, so shall I leave that up there for a while? Okay. The Romantic poet William Blake said that John Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels. All the excitement and interest is with the devils. You may have also heard the cliche that Dante's Inferno is a better read than the Paradiso, because that's where all the drama is and all the interesting personalities, whereas the saints fixated on God are Actually, some philosophers and theologians take this idea and press it to the farthest extent. I just actually read an article in a philosophical journal called Ratio, in which a philosopher says that essentially that it's irrational to desire heaven because, on one hand, extreme longevity, as we've seen, would not be a real heaven. On the other hand, in order for me to be taken up into a real heaven, I would have to be so utterly changed that as the person I am now, I couldn't possibly desire that. Therefore, there is no rationally compelling reason for any human being to desire to go to heaven. So that's the idea that heaven is boring, or that it's alien in some way to our experience of ourselves. But I think what these worries show is really just the defect in our own imagination. That is, of course, when we're bored, in general, it's usually because we're failing to pay attention or because we lack a certain kind of caring. Love is atrophied in some way. I mean, when faith is fresh, you can't be bored. You could always pray, right? It's impossible to be bored. You'd be waiting online. You can always, but of course we fall away from that and we do get bored. But that's no sign that that heaven is boring. It's by definition, it can't be boring. If heaven is boring, you just have to go back to the drawing board and re-describe it. Jonathan Edwards is wonderful at that, describing heaven as the place where, let's see, every gem which death rudely tears away from us here is a glorious jewel forever shining there. Everything that we ever desired will be given to us, purified of whatever was a false motive in that desire. So difficult to imagine, yes. So is God. But boring? I don't think so. I think we can move on then to the third problem, which is the problem with hell. Love can't bear it. So, Edwards, of course, is better known for his sermons on hell. Unfortunately, better known for those than for his sermons on heaven. It's better, I think, to take them both together. He believed, of course, that God could save whomever he willed to save, but also that the condemnation of unrepentant sinners was a matter of divine justice, sovereignty, and glory. Dante, too, the entrance to hell, we're all familiar with the idea that it says, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. But also, Dante also has hell say of itself, justice moved my maker on high, divine power made me, wisdom supreme, and primal love made hell. And that's, of course, hard to understand. Edwards believed, and so did Thomas Aquinas, that beholding the torments of the damned, the satisfaction of justice, thereby actually magnifies the bliss of the saints in heaven. That's a painful thought. I mean, that's not something that I bought onto, actually, that idea. So when I read that, I do have a certain tendency to run to the arms of some of the early fathers like Clement or Origen, or later fathers like George MacDonald, whose message is that hell's consuming fire, the consuming fire of which the letter to the Hebrews speaks, is actually the ardor of divine love, and that its action is purgative rather than punitive. But of course, if you turn hell into purgatory, it means you're suggesting that everyone is saved. Another debate I can't really do justice to or go into, but I'll just say that I think it's very hard to find a complete out-and-out universalist who's actually trying to be a full-fledged Christian. Many people, of course, have looked for ways to hold these two things together, that God's universal salvific will, as in 1 Timothy 2:4, and our creaturely freedom to accept or reject the offer of the presence and salvation of God. So the Hans-Urs von Balthasar, the Swiss theologian I mentioned, has a book called Dare We Hope That All Men Will Be Saved. So the two important words there are dare, it's daring to think this way, but also hope. He's not saying that he knows that everyone will be saved. He's saying that it's a permissible, and indeed he thinks a morally obligatory hope, to hope for the salvation of all. He was very influenced by Karl Barth, who thought the same. I think John Stott did too. Not to dogmatize about this, not to claim that we know the state of all souls, not to think that this creaturely freedom is going to be simply overwritten, but to hope for an empty hell. C.S. Lewis liked to say, he was not a universalist, he liked to say that hell is locked, but it's locked from the inside. That is because the nature of human freedom is such that we can make choices repeatedly, we can sin repeatedly, as Dante depicts the sinners in the Inferno, kind of constantly reenacting the same crimes, such that it becomes a second nature, and you become so committed to that that you become, in a sense, one whole no. A pure no to God and the world. And that would be hell locked from the inside. This is a case where I think I'm thinking along the same lines as Lewis there. I don't trust my own opinion on this subject. I mean, my instincts are, I'm a terrible disciplinarian with my kids. I pretty much just use hugs. And that's not good. It's a good thing, there's a dad there who's a little different. But we don't want to turn this whole drama of sin and salvation into a kind of a spiritualist soap opera of inevitable progress. I think that is the concern. And of course, I guess the bottom line is it's pretty hard to ignore hell, given how much Jesus is warning us about it. Look at that as a warning, and look at that, and hold that together in one's mind with this teaching about God's universal salvific will, and that's pretty much where I think the consensus, the mere Christianity, as Lewis called it, is pointing. But that brings me to purgatory, because in the Christian idea of purgatory, that's where you find a fire that purifies and liberates rather than punishing or destroying. So the fourth problem is the problem with purgatory. Christians don't agree on it. In terms of purgatory, I put on another hat for a little bit, because I teach world religions at Smith College. And I've been very struck by the fact that purgatory is a belief that's founded on a practice. It's the practice of praying for and caring for the dead. And that this is a pretty universal practice. So people of all different kinds of religions, like Buddhists, for instance, have practices that are very much connected to what the purgatory tradition in Christianity has been all about. So what I'm going to say about purgatory, I'm going to draw just a little bit on what I found in studying purgatory and its analogs in different religions. Or at least what I'm going to say is influenced by that, because I don't have time to go into all the details about what the Buddhist purgatories are like or other analogs. But I just want to say that caring for the dead is a practice that, for one thing, has very profound social consequences, that it knits together the human family. It makes the dead, as some people say, an additional age group with which the living, like it or not, have to contend. That is, it puts burdens on the living, like if you're Jewish, the burden of knowing that you need to say the mourner's Kaddish after a family member, and that should have some effect on them, and so it's a filial obligation. Filial piety in all of East Asian countries too is very much connected to this idea that you have to care for your ancestors, say prayers for them, make provisions for them. And this idea, like it or not, and it's often a burden, does support a kind of cultural continuity in times of change. It ensures a kind of continuity of ancestral traditions being passed on to rising generations. Of course, it also has profound implications for the way we think about this interim period between an individual death and whatever is to come. So Christians are thinking about it in terms of the general resurrection of the dead. Buddhists think about it in terms of the interim period between lives, because of the idea of rebirth, and there's this sort of scary intermediate period where you don't know what your next birth's going to be. But anyway, it makes you think about that, because it suggests that the living stand to benefit in some way from the ministrations of the dead, that their condition somehow admits of improvement, and if so, they must not be utterly lost or perfectly fit for whatever the next stage is going to be. In terms of Christianity, obviously, eternal blessedness that we hope is their next stage, their final stage. So they must be, in some sense, a work in progress. I'm reminded of something William James said, the American psychologist, philosopher, 19th century philosopher, and, well, made it into the 20th century. When one of his students sent around a questionnaire about religious beliefs, one of them was, "Do you believe in personal immortality?" And he said, "Never strongly, but increasingly as I get older." And then the question was, "If so, why?" And he said, "Because I am just getting fit to live." Which I think is really interesting, because there's a double meaning there, because there's fitness in the sense of I'm just getting to be a good specimen of humanity, but it's also worthiness. I'm just getting to be worthy to live. I need more time. Purgatory may be a different kind of time from time as we experience it, but that's, I think, the implication of the kind of reflection that people get into when they think about, why am I doing these things for my dead relatives? The practice of doing things for one's dead relatives is not uncontroversial, of course, because it has this implication attached to it. The reformers who were not totally comfortable with that implication of this act of afterlife also wondered about what's appropriate to do for the dead. There's a sense of justice here too, just as there is in terms of the idea of hell. In this case, it's that if people are unfinished projects when they die, that a just cosmos will make provision, will provide a means for them to undergo some kind of correction, perhaps to satisfy old debts, perhaps to cleanse accumulated defilements, perhaps to heal troubled memories. And so I've noticed when I've studied purgatories cross-culturally and across different religions, that typical features are an active interim period between death and the next stage, a practice in which the living assists the dead by prayer, sacrifice, acts of generosity, food offerings, solemn or festive remembrance, and a characteristic moral psychology. And I think, Tal, you said that you've been reading the Purgatorio in the honors program. There you see that characteristic moral psychology, which is one in which sins can actually be numbered and specific penalties or remedies assigned, so you know when they're expiated too, and the P can drop off their forehead. I must say, just a quick little sketch of the word purgatory and the idea of purgatory in Christian history. And then I want to speak about the ways in which purgatory has seemed to some people to belong also to what Lewis called mere Christianity and not to be an exclusively Catholic fetish. Okay, so the word purgatory. Colloquially, I think purgatory has come to mean something like hell light. That's not what it should be, although there's a reason why that happened, and it's an unfortunate development in terms of Christian imagery for purgatory. The reason is that in the Middle Ages, it became more and more infernalized. It began to look more and more like hell, and the sufferings of purgatory were sometimes described as even worse than the pains of hell. So even though they were understood to be purifying, the idea that it's the purifying ardor of divine love kind of got forgotten for a little while, and it was looked at as a kind of torture. So that would be hell light. But it isn't hell light, because in the classical idea of purgatory, everyone who's in purgatory is destined for heaven. There's no back door. There's no way to fall out and fall into hell. So actually, the sequel we're doing to the Book of Heaven, the Book of Hell, I was very sorry to realize that we didn't include purgatory in the Book of Heaven, because now we have to put it in the Book of Hell, because they're not going to let us do a Book of Purgatory. But purgatory should have been placed in the Book of Heaven, because it's the antechamber to heaven. It's not, one of the nicer districts of hell. So originally then, and there's a series of moments in which it was defined as a matter of Catholic belief of councils. I won't go through all that. Leading up to the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. Purgatory refers to the process, this is like a verbal noun, the process by which those who die in a state of grace are made ready for heaven. So again, everyone in purgatory is already enrolled among the saints, already forgiven, and already absolved of the guilt for their sins. So it isn't, classically, it isn't the place where you still got sins that need to be forgiven. That's supposed to have already happened, which of course reinforces the whole penitential system within Catholicism with all its abuses as well as its uses. But it's a matter of completing the work of repair, of experiencing the remainder of what they call the temporal punishment that would have in life been part of the normal process of penance, of repentance, of penance and restitution. And also purifying minor faults and tics and character that would make an eternity of blessedness simply unbearable. You wouldn't be fit for heaven. You wouldn't enjoy it. It would be boring or something overwhelming if you hadn't been through purgatory. That's the classic idea. Now, where indulgences come in is this idea that indulgences could be granted by the church from the treasury of merits, which is Christ's infinite merit and all the merit of all the saints. I don't know what happens when you add something to infinity, though. It's kind of redundant. But Catholicism goes in for a lot of redundancy like that. Kind of like, because to catch everybody, you have to keep at it. So that those indulgences could remit some or all of this temporal punishment, and intercessory prayers by the living or by the saints to whom they appeal could make it more fruitful an experience and less severe a suffering. So you have this thing where you can pray for the dead and you can pray to the dead. Purgatory as a noun is a place name, but it wasn't originally a place name. And this is another problem with purgatory when you start to think of it in spatial terms. But it's a translation of the Latin purgatorium, which does mean a place of purging. It's like if you went to a Roman bath, you visit the caldarium, which is where you sweat off the dead skin cells after some serious scraping. You remember how Eustace gets scraped off the dragon cells? Well, that's this idea. This is definitely explicitly a purgatory thing that Lewis has in mind there, the de-dragoning of Eustace. So you scrape off the dead skin cells, you sweat them off, and then you plunge into the frigidarium, from which we get Frigidaire, a brand of refrigerators, to seal your pores. And then there's what I'm trying to say is the purgatorium is like the Roman bath. It's where you get to scrape and burn and freeze away the last remnants of your dragon scales. But if it's a place, it's pretty hard to place this place. There's no official doctrine in Catholicism that pinpoints purgatory's place on the map. So that's why Dante had this sort of artistic freedom to place his purgatory intentionally far away from hell on the 7-story mountain with the earthly paradise at its summit. There. There's a French medievalist named Jacques Le Goff who published a book called The Birth of Purgatory, in which he argued that purgatory didn't become a place until the year 1170, precisely, which is when he found the first instance of purgatorium used as a substantive, as a noun. But this was actually an overstatement because, I don't have time to show them all, but there's lots and lots of medieval visions in which people apparently die and they come back to life and they describe their journey. So this is like the sort of folk basis for the Divine Comedy. They describe a journey where they visit usually hell first, but they end up visiting heaven, hell, and purgatory. So purgatory is a place in those visions. So I really don't understand why Jacques Legoff, said it all had to be just in this text. So it's long before 1170 that these visions began to be told. Saint Bede, the 8th century scholar, included one of those stories in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, of a guy who had, this is essentially a near-death experience. And I stumbled upon all this when I was writing that book about near-death experience, that there were all these medieval stories. It sounded a lot like the stories Raymond Moody was telling in his book Life After Life. It came back out in 1975, and everybody was saying, this is brand new. It's because medical technology allows us to resuscitate people from death. Therefore, now we're getting for the first time the real story of what it's like to die. But actually, structurally, the story is very similar to the ones that were being told in the Middle Ages and can be found in other cultures as well, this return from death motif. It's a wonderful didactic story. If you have someone who's like an eyewitness who can say how awful it is to be in hell and can live to tell the tale, who can say how awful it is to be in purgatory but hopeful, who can say how indescribably wonderful heaven is. None of them, by the way, say that heaven was boring. All of them, what they all say is heaven was so indescribably wonderful, I didn't want to come back to life, but I was sent back. This is one of them. This is the vision of Tundal. The story goes back to 1149. It was told by an Irish Benedictine monk and translated into 15 vernacular languages. It's this errant in both senses, knight Tundal, who was kind of a high liver and suddenly falls dead at a banquet. He gets revived 3 days later and talks about how his guardian angel took him on his soul. The soul is depicted as a sort of like a little homunculus, little, replica of the naked person. From purgatory to hell, to the earthly paradise, to heaven, and back to life. This is a test bridge where if you have sins that weigh you down, you're going to, topple off it. That the guardian angel is taking him there, so he's just barely okay. They get to the pit of hell, and he is about to be dragged in by a demon, but the guardian angel helps him there. They get to this weird wall where you have people who were bad but not very bad, and their statues are there. They look through a gate and they see all these happy people with the flowery field and the fountain, the sort of classical images of the pleasant place. And Tundal thinks, oh, this must be heaven. This is a typical feature of these things is then people, when they get to purgatory, they think this must be hell. And the guide says, no, it's not hell. Hell's even worse. Here, this must be heaven. He said, no, this is not heaven. Heaven is even better. It's better than you could possibly imagine. This is just the earthly paradise. This is for the people who are good, but not very good. So mixed souls. There were stories of a place that you could go to, which is still a pilgrimage site, although it's no longer an entrance to purgatory, St. Patrick's Purgatory in Northern Ireland. If you could get into there and survive purgatory, you wouldn't have to go through it at death. So it's a penitential pilgrimage. And that still is actually a pilgrimage site where people do a lot of penance, like fasting and crawling on their knees and stuff for the same idea. So these visions made purgatory a place for the Western Christian imagination. And it was also a time, an answer to this puzzle about the interim period between death and the final resurrection and judgment, and also a way of talking about the sort of preliminary judgment. So in talking about it as a place and as a time, some sort of crude things came into play here. And I think what's interesting right now, in terms of the ecumenical aspects of this question about purgatory, is that a number of Protestant thinkers are getting interested in purgatory. This goes back pretty far, actually. And the Catholic thinking about purgatory is meeting them at least halfway by jettisoning the infernalization of purgatory, by no longer talking about it so much as a place. They didn't abolish indulgences, but the sense of a kind of a mechanical, works righteousness sort of way of dealing with the temporal punishment due to sin has certainly been dropped. And instead, you get Pope Benedict in his, I think it was his second encyclical, Spe Salvi, Saved by Hope, talking about purification, which means talking about something very much like sanctification. So you can have very interesting dialogue about what purgatory might mean beyond this amazing imagery, which probably has its place too, but which can be misleading. This is from the Trésor du Duc de Berry. Actually, purgatory is only rarely depicted visually in art. And in order to depict it, that increased the infernalization of it. It also gave rise to a very charming devotion to what are called the holy souls in purgatory. There are confraternities and prayer guilds devoted to relieving their pain. There's, the old-fashioned Catholic idea of if you're suffering, to offer it up for the holy souls in purgatory to reduce their pain. This is an example of that. This is prayer and almsgiving comforting the holy souls in purgatory. Actually, that's Lady Prayer, and she's got a soothing pot of ointment to heal the souls in the flames. So I think that's what purgatory really is the house of Lady Prayer. It's this idea of prayer for the dead, prayer to the dead, prayer. It's the idea of being part of this communion of saints, looking out for one another, carrying one another's burdens. So in Dante's Purgatory, the souls of the formerly proud, when they pray for deliverance, say they're praying not for ourselves, but for those who remain behind us. That means they have been delivered. They've been delivered from the prison of a kind of selfish self-regard. So, the abuses of this whole purgatory system are well known. That Luther and Calvin certainly pointed them out. Purgatory was a vain imagining without scriptural support, a pernicious fiction of Satan that makes void the cross of Christ. But I think if we look at it in the light of that earlier icon, that is always understanding what's distinctive about Christian ways of looking at the soul and immortality, the sheer gratuitousness of salvation, the completeness of the work of the Passion, the saving work of the Passion being then imparted, then I think we have something promising here. Stephen Greenblatt, does anyone know him? He's a Shakespeare scholar. He wrote a book called Hamlet and Purgatory, in which he claims that purgatory kind of went underground after it was abolished. And Hamlet's father, he thinks, is a Catholic ghost who is, in visiting his Protestant son, is asking for remembrance and suffrage as well as vengeance. John Donne's poetry is very purgatorial. It's just that instead of purgatory being a place somewhere in the earth or somewhere else, it's his body. The patristic and early medieval writers who spoke about purgatory also said, and Gregory the Great says this, and he's seen as the great sort of purgatory person, that purgatory begins in this life. So it is a process of purification, of repentance, of receiving forgiveness and grace. And as such, I think you can find it in, perhaps in the Puritan allegorical imagination in the Pilgrim's Progress, when Christian and hopeful, as they're getting close to the celestial city, fall sick with desire for it. And in a sense, they're healed by this sickness. Jonathan Edwards, when we spoke about, of whose belief in the divorce of heaven and hell there can be no doubt, did imagine a purification at death, when God will burnish the soul until it shines with seraphic splendor. Sanctification, as I'm suggesting, is a way of speaking about purgatory. And some Protestant writers, notably Jerry Walls, who has a new book out about purgatory, has suggested welcoming the idea back on these terms. I think I should stop here. The pictures I have. Oh yeah, Marley's ghost. I'm convinced, because the purgatory tradition, especially in English culture, gave rise to the first ghost stories, the first English ghost stories. Those ghosts are all souls from purgatory coming back to bug the living to give them the help they need. That produced this whole genre of English ghost stories. Well, I'm convinced that Marley is that kind of figure, because he's coming to do some good. You know? Well, you could say that even someone who's condemned to hell might do that, but I get the sense, maybe I'm wrong, that that he does speak of undergoing a penance, right? If you're in hell, you're not undergoing penance. Penance is a healing thing. And it's through his intercession that Ebenezer Scrooge gets a second chance. So I think what we've got in Dickens here is it's that infernalized purgatory that gives us ghosts and so on. So that's why you get the clanging of the chains and all of that. It's terrible, but it's not final. The First World War seems to have prompted a major rediscovery of purgatory by English-speaking poets and theologians. In fact, in response to the war, an Anglican doctrinal commission asked pastors and theologians to sanction prayer for the dead and to speak of the interim period after death as a time of growth and purification. And I think this was part of what helped an ecumenical Protestant thinker like C.S. Lewis to reclaim purgatory under its original name, while his Catholic friend, Tolkien, was definitely drawing upon purgatory for the sacrificial and penitential themes of his romance. Walls actually has a chapter on Lewis in his book on purgatory. Lewis talks about how our souls demand purgatory because, we want to have that Eustace Scrub experience, where he talks about how he's always spontaneously felt a need to pray for the dead. But I think the greatest 20th century poet of purgatory was this guy, T.S. Eliot. And it's interesting, this memorial plaque, it talks about praying for the repose of purgatory, of Eliot and the purgatory. But Ash Wednesday is based on the Purgatorio. In East Coker, the world is a purgatorial hospital ward. Little Gidding focuses on the purgatorial fire of love that burns off shameful memories and restores hope, that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well by the purification of the motive in the ground of our beseeching. That's the Julian of Norwich quote. Statement that I quoted before. And that's what I think we're all about here, is we need that purification of the motives in the ground of our hope, whether for immortality, however construed, for eternal life, for purification, for redemption. And of course, we have to make sure that we avoid any interpretation that renders superfluous the saving work of our Redeemer. Some people said that all these near-death stories were being popularized were doing that. They were emptying out Easter. We didn't need it if, just dying is your ticket. You have to watch out for that. We have to watch out for whatever would distract us from the hope for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. But we also need to make sense of this ancient and honorable practice of prayer to the dead and for the dead for their peace in Christ. And that sense that we're all in that together as a kind of pilgrimage together really appeals to me. Thank you.